Hello again, Faith Unfiltered podcast listeners. This is Blake Smith, project manager for Faith Unfiltered podcast. You're about to hear part two of the two-part No Filter episode featuring Robin Linkhart and guests Nancy Ross and Larissa Kanno Kindred. If you haven't listened to part one yet, you may want to listen to that first. You can find a link to part one in the show notes. But here's part two. Take it away, Robin.
You've talked about some surprises that have emerged along the way, and you've also talked about really difficult moments, not only difficult moments for those you were serving as they just kind of poured out their hearts and souls, but acknowledging that you are part of the population that you're serving and your experience is cannot be separated from that religious institution and that experience. And what I hope everybody remembers is we are reading about a particular experience that is inside a global experience that has all these other contexts and cultures that also are threaded in and superimposed. And it's really, really complicated. And as you've talked, I could just feel this peeling apart of all these layers and interwoven aspects of the human experience, physical, social, spiritual. Um, this is a really, really hard and complex thing, this endeavor that you have undertaken. Were there any other surprises or difficult times along the way that you experienced?
I think for me, this actually wasn't a surprise for me, but I think it was difficult, is that I had a lot of scrutiny like that was directed towards me. Nancy, I think when you were doing your research, were you still active in the LDS church?
When we did the survey, Jessica and I were both active. Like when we
Okay.
did that, we were both active. Yeah.
So I had already like I had separated from the LDS church for a little while, and I was trained in, like feminist research methods, which is like you are transparent, you give full informed consent, you understand who you are to the people. And so my consent form before anyone took the survey said like I'm no longer practicing. I did wear garments. I have been through the temple, but I no longer practice. However, like this is how I'm trying to be respectful. I just want to understand LDS, the voices of LDS women, and I think one thing that is it can be a difficult realm to function in because there was quite a bit of like scrutiny, or there was, and I'm not going to say that it was like, like I was getting emails all the time, but like there was like a fair amount of people that reached out to me that told me that I was being inappropriate, or like, why would you do this? It's so disrespectful. And so, and I kind of, again, like I kind of anticipated this, and I understand that it's a little fraught when you are going to do some research on anybody's like sacredly held beliefs. I mean, I'm a sensitive person, so I think that I just think that was something that was, it's a difficult like environment to kind of like walk around in. And I actually like, this is like my own opinion. This is my hot take, is I myself as an ex-Mormon woman, I actually think that I am well equipped to like engage in this type of research because I don't have any institutional ties. But I found that like many women will tell me maybe more than they would have told somebody who had no link, like I know the language, I can use the same, like we have this shared thing, but also like there is this element where there's people that kind of will invalidate or question or say like that you have, you have bad motives or things like that. And so, you always try to just take it with a grain of salt, but also like, like I think that we tried to engage in this space very respectfully. And so I think that is something that is just been interesting about working within this space is that it's a space where like it's thin ice, you know? So that's maybe just something that's an interesting thing to add.
In one of the later additions to the project is that the sociologist who reviewed our first draft of the book said that, and we had to do a huge reorganization of everything. She was like, you really need a chapter on garment history. And I'd been like, no, this is a sociological study. We're not falling down like the rabbit hole of history. And then I ended up compiling a chapter for the book on garment history, which I think is a real strength of the project and a topic I continue to work on, even with this being published pretty soon now. And one of the things that is one of the quotes that I came across in someone who's commenting on garment history is that it's like doing a square dance or holding a square dance on like a field of landmines. And this whole topic has felt when I came across this quote, I was like, yes, that is exactly what doing this research has been like. It's been like holding a square dance on a field of landmines. And so that where you never really know when you're gonna like when things are gonna explode and be kind of tricky, but I feel like that's exactly what it has felt like.
So we're coming at this at a point on the journey. It sounds like the journey is continuing, even as we're talking about what has brought us to this place. And you both have experienced years of research and observations and analysis of data, and also, your personal experiences in the midst of this and things that came along that you never suspected. So at this point, how would you frame the outcomes? And obviously, the book is going to bring us into some of this, but how do you frame the outcomes? You talked about a hypothesis that you had coming into it, that the male and female experience would be very different and that men would find this so much easier than women, and soon kind of had to let go of that hypothesis. But were there any theories or new discoveries that came out that we will read about in the book?
So the central argument of the book is that garments serve today as a religious technology to restrain the sexual behavior of LDS adults. And this is primarily in a population who are married, but to restrain their sexual behavior. And this was I would say, a long slog and a really hard place to arrive, and to really acknowledge that this is what the data suggested, this is what my own experiences have suggested, and that there are a number of ways, and the book describes this, in which that language of restraint and that language of control is hidden within different religious concepts. It's hidden within religious concepts of sacredness. It's hidden within religious concepts of obedience. And it is hidden within religious concepts of worthiness. But all of those that like sacredness and worthiness and obedience, which sound like positive things, and they're framed in a very positive way in LDS teaching, are really like, kind of traps, or the shadow side of those positive sounding concepts that, we'd engaged in from childhood onward, were really also the language of secrecy and shame and control. And that all of that messaging, together with other messaging about modesty, and the inappropriateness of sexual behavior, and the concern, various concerns kind of get baked into the meaning of garments. Garments end up taking on a lot of different meanings. They kind of start as underwear that represents the practice of polygamy, right? Which is kind of, which was perceived in the American media as like an unrestrained sexuality that created so many problems for Mormons. And of course, so much of LDS history is shaped by exactly wanting to find distance and from these stories of polygamy. And then in the 20th century for the LDS Church, there is a real effort to rehabilitate the image of Mormonism in the mind of Americans. And so garments get repurposed as a tool of sexual restraint. The historical narrative played out pretty well. And our survey really shows that is how like if there is an ultimate function of garments, that is the ultimate function of garments, whether that is intended or not intended. And I believe it is intended, maybe not always to the degree into which it is executed. But that's kind of how they function. And that is, when I realized this, I was both finally, building way to the conclusion. It was both a huge relief to realize I am at the end of this project now. And it was also deeply personally devastating to kind of reach this conclusion. And this is part of the difficulty of researching things that are personally meaningful, but I'm not sure I would have gotten anywhere near the conclusions that we needed to get to unless I'd had the like personal insistence and realization that for my own sanity, I needed to like do this the whole way, if that makes sense.
Larissa, do you have anything to add to that as far as theories or new discoveries?
I don't know. I think what Nancy said really like covers it really well. Yeah, I think like so nobody has ever really laid out like the history of garments. It's very hard to track, and it's going to be very you have to make assumptions. It's very, like it just wasn't documented well. And so we kind of like piece this together. So I do think that'll be like a really important an important thing to understand. And I think maybe, I don't know, maybe something that I feel like is really kind of like a little bit of a revelation that comes out of this. I think Nancy, this is kind of what you were saying, is that there's so much meaning, there's different meanings around garments, and everybody believes that their meaning is what the church told them. We have people that say like these were never about modesty. They're like, these were never about modesty, and which is kind of wild because you're like, oh, that was said in general conference, that is documented that they were about modesty for a very long time. And so it's just interesting, like the narratives change, around garments. And so we see people have like so many, they create their own meanings around garments. And I actually think that's a beautiful part of garments, is that people can create their own meaning around them. I think that's actually best case scenario, is for people to take this and to really create their own meaning. But it has been shaped institutionally, and because of the hierarchical institution of the church, you've got like high leadership kind of dictating what the narrative is around garments. And this will be an ongoing project, because even like as recently as, I don't know if it was this past general conference, but maybe it was the one before that, somebody said in it, like, the reasons that garments cover so much of your body is because it's a symbol of like the blood and the atonement of Christ. And I was like, that is really new. Like, and we, like, I think garments always were a symbol of like, like your covenants to God or things like that. But the coverage being linked to like, these have to cover a lot of your body because it's like the blood of Christ. I was like, wow, like we're actually seeing a new narrative being formed around garments and their coverage. Whereas, for decades and decades, it really was based on modesty. And Russell Nelson, who was recently the president of the church, he's gave one of the core talks talking about that. And so it's like so interesting. And so I don't know. I think for me, like this was, for me, that was kind of like, I don't know, like a sort of a revelation that came out of this, and is the way that people shape, create meaning around this. And that's not like a theory that came out of this or anything. Um, but I do think it's something that like the data showed that was fascinating. And I think it will be ongoing. It will be interesting to see how this is shaped over time, because I think this is still something that's happening and being reworked and reshaped. And so yeah, that's all I'll add.
I,
Yeah.
I I will also add, Robin, that Emma Smith has a place in garment history, and I have mentioned this to a few other people, and of course, we love Emma in Community of Christ, and I mentioned somewhat this little tidbit of garment history to someone not long ago, and they were a little horrified that our beloved Emma had anything to do with it. But when garments were first instituted, and they were first made, Emma and Eliza Arsenault, Emma Smith and Eliza Arsenault, felt that they didn't look complete in their existing form, and that they needed collars to be like a complete finished garment. And so Emma's collars that she added, and of course, collars are no longer part of garments, and haven't been since like 1923. Did they get removed then? Maybe. But Emma added little collars which were supposed to sit underneath your outer clothing. But Eliza Arsenault, who was a little bit extra, insisted that the collars were really big and that they'd be like visible on the outside of clothing. So our beloved Emma is also a part of this garment history as well. And that doesn't necessarily surprise me, and it won't surprise many LDS Mormons, but it might surprise folks in Community of Christ. So there we go.
Fascinating. That will be a surprise, I think. So, what question is this book trying to answer? And even asking that question, I realize this book may not be trying to answer a question, but at the very least, how might this book be inviting readers to sit with a question?
Yeah, so I would say that our central question is, what is the lived experience of Mormons with their garments? And underpinning that question were really three open-ended research questions that help us kind of answer that. And that's, what do garments mean to you? How do you feel when you wear garments? And why do you wear garments? And so that really, and these were the three questions where people really kind of shared a lot. And we felt like in many ways that, because talking about garments, maybe not in the era of garments and TikTok, but prior to sleeveless garments and garments becoming popular to talk about on TikTok, there's long been a strong taboo about talking about garments. And so it was like people were sharing their secrets, their long held secrets. So it's really a question about lived experience, right? There's a lot of, in Mormon studies and in religious studies, and in sociology of religion, decades ago, there was a strong emphasis on institutional histories, right? What are the institutional histories of churches? And today there is much more of a movement of, what do adherents of particular religious groups, what do they experience? What is their ordinary life like? And so this book is really trying to capture that lived experience, that like on the ground, ordinary people experience, rather than being a history of how church leaders experience their garments.
Thanks, Nancy. Did you have anything to add to that, Larissa?
No, I think that was great.
So I'm really intrigued with how you might perceive the outcomes of this research informing the world at large? I mean, are there learnings that come from this research and things that the book will explore that have a broader application beyond Mormonism? And another way to ask that is, how does this book speak into our current cultural, social, and spiritual moment?
I apologize for hogging the time here. I want to come back to something that Larissa said earlier, which was a really important point, and I really love how she makes this particular point in her intro to the book, which is that that wearing garments is a central everyday practice of Mormonism. We might say it is one of the most central practices of Mormonism that has not been studied, but reveals so much about the history of the community, the internal dynamics of the religious community, the beliefs and practices and policies. There is so much that is revealed through this one item of clothing or set of items of clothing, and that garments aren't like on the weird periphery of the LDS experience. They are often quite at the heart of it, and it's also, this much maligned and much mocked thing, and also misunderstood thing. And that's what we're trying to communicate, is that there is this central religious practice, and typical believers have not written a lot about this because there's been a pretty explicit taboo. But we're trying to share experience in a way that honors the experiences of people in our survey, both the very positive and the very negative and everything in between, to offer in many ways what I think is a very sympathetic and human picture of garments. What else do you think our project religious studies and studies of Mormonism, Larissa?
So one thing I think is really important when we kind of like zoom out with this is I think one of the things that is lost, that's very sad about like this secrecy around garments, is that I think it keeps LDS women from relating to other women who wear religious clothing. And there are many, many, many religions that wear religious clothing. And so I, like I think that is such an important piece, is to talk about it so that we can put it in context or make comparisons to Jewish women, Muslim women, like Sikhs wear certain, like there's religious clothing is very, very common. And so, some of the cross-cultural research that I've done, like, is that it's similar, is that some people really relate well to it. Some people may have a more complex relationship to it. And so I think that I think this is something that I feel like I want for readers, is to really put LDS women kind of like in the context of like broader, like how people relate to religion and religious clothing in general. And it's interesting because the more I think Muslim women probably have been studied the most when it comes to looking at the impact of religious clothing. But they've found like that there's a lot of like protective factors about wearing religious clothing, or there's a religious identity piece that's very, very connecting for them with their communities. And so, like, I think that there's a lot to be found if we, like look under the surface and, like bring this out in the open and talk about it. And I think one of the benefits that can come from that is relating and understanding how other people, other women how find meaning when they're negotiating gender and religion. How do they do that? Like, can you relate to them now? And so for me, I think ultimately the more and more we talk about, like Nancy was saying, that we talk about lived experience, the more likely we are to break down barriers, which is the key to, right, like to, social justice. And so that we have better understanding, is instead of saying like, that's weird, why do they do that? Instead, we can say like, oh, I actually understand I understand why you're doing that, because we also have our own thing that's similar, and I understand why we do that, and so I think that I think there's only benefits to learning and understanding, because I actually think we will find ways to connect people. And I'm like a true feminist at heart, and so I want women to understand each other and to relate and to have camaraderie. And I think that, again, going back to kind of how I got into this in the first place, I want LDS women, I want wearers to like take their place. I want them to like take their place in a global conversation about how women do this. They have the right to be there. They have something so valuable to share. And so yeah, so I feel like that's such an important message that I hope that people who are readers will like get from this, or even people who have no idea about like Mormonism will read this and say, "Oh yes, that's really interesting." And so I presented my research at the Association for Women in Psychology. It's one of the biggest like women's psych organizations in the world. I presented it there, and to a completely like non-LDS or LDS adjacent audience. And some of the people that came to talk to me after were Muslim women. And they were like, I had no idea that like we were so similar to LDS women. And I was like, yeah, it's really interesting. And they were like, oh, we see this same thing where some women are like wearing hijab in a different way, or some of them are saying like, no, I don't need this. But some of them are really like, no, this is really important to me. And so they were like, no, it's really cool. We are also seeing these type of movements within our community, and we didn't know that LDS women, that we had this like shared sense of like experience. And so really like I feel like ultimately that is like kind of, that's like an aspirational goal, is that people will have better understanding and will be able to relate to other groups that essentially like have had very, very similar experiences.
So, if you were to have one hope about what a reader would hear when they read this book, um, or maybe an overarching hope, because gosh, this is just so multi-dimensional that it can connect on so many different levels. Would there be something that you would hope a reader would hear from this book?
I would go back to um because it's so individual, what I would hope from like an individual reader is that they would understand that garments have a very like it's a varied history, like they've got their whole they've like it's a whole thing. The meaning has changed, the shape of them has changed, the patterns have changed, the narratives have changed. And I would hope that a reader, if it was someone who was a garment wearer, I would hope that they would read that and it would like help them to understand that they can create their own meaning, and garments can be to them whatever brings them close to God or makes them feel like this is my identity. Like I would hope that they would just feel that type of freedom to like create their own meaning around it. And if you were someone who was not LDS and you were reading it, I would say my hope for them was that they would understand LDS women better and say like, oh, okay, this is like really interesting, this like variation, and they're not all the same. And so I would just say, so I think those would be my two wishes for readers, depending on if you were in the community or if you were outside of that.
I love what you just said, Larissa. I love those things. I think my more in a sense simplistic but not takeaway that I'd want anyone picking up this book to come away with is that this is just really complicated, right? This isn't like simple, or that there's nothing about this that is simple. It has a really complicated history, which intersects with gender and race and lots of other things and sexuality. And it continues to have like a complicated lived experience. I'd want both people who are conforming believers and people who are non-conforming believers and outsiders to just understand that the experience of this thing is more complex than they think it is. And that it's then important to listen to people talk about their experiences and how this impacts them.
Is there anything that you really wanted to share today that I haven't asked you about? I'm getting a no nod from each of you. So I just want to thank you so much for making time to come and share with us today about your forthcoming book. Listeners, you've been hearing from Nancy Ross and Larissa Kanno Kindred. And Nancy and Larissa, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
And as always, a very special thanks to all of our listeners. If you would like to order garments, Mormon Garments, Sacred and Secret, find it at Amazon.com or click the link in today's show notes. To hear more about our guests, including Nancy's faith journey to Community of Christ, check out other podcast links also listed in our show notes. This is your host, Robin Linkhart, and you are listening to Faith Unfiltered podcast. Go out and make the world a better place. Take good care. Bye-bye.